Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Well, hello, and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. I've entitled this particular podcast, Straight Talk. And do you wonder why people may have a hard time having discussions with you? Do your discussions turn into arguments? So I'm going to ask the question, do you invite conversation or confrontation? Now, you could be well-intentioned, but lose direction when the conversation takes an unexpected turn, such as when the discussion brings up something that you didn't anticipate. So you sort of get surprised. Now, something to remember is when you're having a conversation, especially when you're talking about problems with things, you don't have control over what somebody else says or does. So when these things happen, hopefully they don't throw you too much, and you shouldn't get too excited, shouldn't lose your temper, because you could undo all the good intentions you had by trying to bring up the topic and have a conversation. So obviously, talking about things that are charged could have some consequences that we're certainly trying to avoid. Let's say you're trying to avoid having a breakdown in the relationship. And bringing up difficult things obviously is not easy, but I applaud you for taking it on, because if you're one of those kinds of individuals that tends to sweep things under the rug, well, what tends to happen in those cases, these things tend to come back and they come out in other sorts of ways. Passive-aggressive individuals, and if you don't know what the term means, what it means is that these are people who don't necessarily deal with things very directly, very upfront, and a lot of times it's because of fear. So rather than come to you and have a conversation, they tend to do things behind your back. And an example of that would be is if you were to ask a question, the passive part of them will just play along and agree with you. The aggressive part would be behind your back. They would say things that are disparaging or negative. And there are people that do those kinds of things. And a lot of it is, it's manipulation. It's fear. And to help bridge the communication and to have less of that, a passive aggressive kind of thing happen, is you kind of have to be willing to face it head on. And number one, if you're the person that wants to have the conversation, write things down that you want to talk about so that you can stay on task, you can stay on topic. Because one of the things that tends to happen in discussions is we tend to meander. And by doing that, we run the risk of not really resolving something that brought us to the conversation in the first place. And sometimes these things can turn into blow-ups, arguments, because we don't stay on topic. And it's okay to talk about some of these other things, but what I suggest is you write them down for a more appropriate time. Because sometimes these other things are something you need to do a little research on, something you need to do a little thinking about, because when they come up in the middle of a conversation, let's say it's kind of sort of gets you sidetracked, it could be very upsetting to be pulled away, and it might even seem like someone is trying to cloud the conversation or create a diversion so as not to have you talk about what's really going on here. And this is kind of the art of problem solving. Counselors tend to do this in a way because the counselor is the referee. They're the neutral party. And it's important that they learn to give equal time to both of the partners. But what counselors tend to do is they try to get a gist of the problem itself and then help the two individuals who have the breakdown of communication do a better job of talking to each other. And one of the things that the referee is there to do is to help the person who might feel intimidated have a voice. So that is, if you feel like you are very afraid of talking, then the counselor is there to help you put your thoughts together, get your words together to be able to say them to the person who needs to hear them. Now, this is very important because this is sort of what helps you get more empowerment to own how you feel and to have a safe place to discuss these things to the person that needs to hear them. Now, I'm talking an example of couples counseling here, because teaching you how to take ownership of your feelings and to represent yourself is a very important life skill. And oftentimes people don't learn those kinds of things in a very healthy way. Sometimes they learn it in the passive-aggressive way. And the passive-aggressive way is to just pretend like things are okay. And then when the person has their back turned, or just as an illustration, then to go on and do what they wanted to do without really problem solving. But anyway, back to my point here, which is that illustration was what a counselor would do. But when you don't have that, you're left to do this on your own. And this is where you kind of have to self-police. And it's about staying on task, staying on topic, and giving yourself and the person you're in the conversation with an opportunity to speak, and to speak freely, respectfully, but speak freely. And remembering to stay on topic, you have your notes there because you do want to not only talk about what you've written down on your page, but I think what's important is to write down what's being said as a response to these things. Because in doing that, if there's something that you need clarification on when the person is talking to you, because you may be hearing things that you don't have any reference to or any information on, and you don't want to get too bogged down, but you should write down things. And there's a little technique that every counselor knows, and it's called mirroring. And what that basically means is when the person is speaking, you are going to repeat back some of the things that they say. You're going to paraphrase it. And that's to let the person know that you have an understanding of what they're talking about. Things like this go a long way to help de-escalate confrontations or misunderstandings. And it also shows that you are trying to make a valid attempt at trying to solve a problem. And they can learn to do this themselves. As you show an example of mirroring, then when it's your turn to talk, then they can do the same thing for you. And these kinds of techniques, they're very simple, they're very basic, but these kinds of techniques work in it'll work for children, it works for adults, it works for adolescents. And when you use these kinds of techniques for speaking, for dealing with conflict, then it helps to de-escalate. Because the thing that happens for a lot of people is what really sets them on edge is when they feel they have no options, then people get very, very upset, they're very irate, and sometimes they can get a little bit out of control. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to come right back and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. Stay tuned.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. At the end of the last segment, I was talking about people who become a little upset, who can become irate to a bit. When you're having conversations about things, trying to get to the bottom of it, sometimes some people can feel blindsided, they can feel ambushed, and in the example that I was sharing earlier, it's that when they don't feel like they have options, then people tend to react out of fear, frustration, anger, irate. I mean, that's typically what happens. Or they can do the opposite, they can shut down. But all of this tends to have the same sort of result in which the conversation tends to stop and we're not making any progress. And I'm sharing this detail because if you're the person who's trying to have the conversation and the one you're talking to is getting upset, getting irate, or becoming eerily silent, then you have to understand that you're not making progress. And I want you to understand what's going on with that person so that you don't become in reaction mode. So I'm going to give you some options. I'm going to give you some understanding about that. Number one, I've just explained a little bit, but maybe the idea here is to backtrack, walk back to where you were having a good conversation and making some progress and work on that. The other thing is it's okay to take a pause. Take a pause, come back in a little bit when you've had a chance to de-escalate. In fact, that's probably would be the first choice. But given that what we're trying to do is prevent confrontation, and we want to practice healthy techniques, because when you get in the habit of handling discussions this way, then I think what you are creating is you're creating an environment which is safe. It's safe for you to have a conversation. It's safe for the person you're talking with. And you have more confidence that these things are going to have a resolution. And it's going to be something that's workable. What passive-aggressive individuals, one of the things that they fear, and again, this is for your information, one of the things that passive-aggressive people fear is they fear being dominated. They fear being given more than they're capable of handling. And one of their ways of dealing with that is to pretend to go along with the situation, and on the back end that is out of sight from you, they may struggle with it. They may attempt to do what they said that they had agreed to, but it doesn't come to fruition. Therefore, and on some level, they may feel like they are a failure. And without the tools, without the skills to be able to navigate this, then it just falls apart. And what they hope is that they're not found out. And in all of this, it's fear. Passive-aggressive people have a lot of fear, because if they didn't, then they'd do a better job of confronting things. And when I say confront, that means addressing it. It doesn't mean get into fights or something heavier than that. It just means to address it. And if you've not had a good example of problem solving, most people fear that when you address, or not most, but a lot of people feel that when you begin to address something, that it's going to turn into an argument. It's going to break down. And we already have enough of that. So practicing some of the things that I've talked about, writing things down ahead of time so that you can stay on task. Being calm in the discussion is very, very important, very helpful. It leads to confidence that the person you are having the conversation with knows that they won't be necessarily overwhelmed. See, people with very strong personalities can be a little overpowering. They can be intimidating. And if you're one of those individuals who is very confident, very assured, you can be very intimidating and not even know it. Thereby, you can have good intentions, but we always have to learn to check in with the person we were having a conversation with. That's critically important, because knowing where they are in the conversation, how they feel, are they scared? Are they feeling intimidated? Are they feeling heard? And are they receiving the information that you're trying to present? Because all of these things can lead to breakdowns of communication, lead to misunderstandings. And that's unfortunate. Because if you start with the basics are that we want to resolve the problem. We care about each other. We can and one of the things, another thing to point out here is to say, hey, I want us to have a good outcome. Put that out there, because that helps set the tone for the conversation as to that there are no traps here. There isn't an attempt to bully you or to control you, but it's really a desire for both of us to have a conversation and to come to a resolution with something that we can both work on, that we can both work the same direction. And as you do that over time, you get better at it. See, this is the thing that's also critically important in understanding this technique, or techniques like this. If you don't practice them, then you're going to struggle at it. And as human beings are, we have conflicts all the time. Some things don't turn into arguments. In fact, a lot of things don't have to become argumentative. I mean, you can be passionate about whatever the conversation is without overpowering someone else, without having somebody else feel like they're being dominated by your energy and your intensity. But understand that reading somebody else in the conversation, just like I shared earlier, reading their reaction helps you know when to pull back. And by that, I mean, by not being so intense. When you can do that, it shows, number one, that I think you're a good leader, you're a good listener, and that you care about the other person. And giving the other person equal time to share their feelings, and maybe even be a lead from time to time in the discussion. Help them with the technique. And as you grow to do this together, then you will learn to problem solve. And I think a lot less passive aggressiveness will exist, because you will have shown the love and the nurturing and the support, and you'll be nurturing a good technique and an idea. And this is really, really good to show children, because quite often what children lack, unless they are taught, is empathy. They often watch conversations and learn by observation how to talk to someone else. And if what they observe is a lot of anger and a lot of aggression, and that's how a person wins, then this is what kids practice. So using these other techniques, I think it works more universally. And it's not about win-win, but it's about learning how to be a good listener, because those skills pay dividends forever and ever. I'm going to take a break, and I'll be back after the message. Stay tuned.
Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast. Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Well, hello, and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and I've been talking about how to resolve problems. You know, I started out with the example of passive-aggressive, and, you know, there's a lot of reasons why people behave that way, and I gave some illustrations. A lot of it's fears behind that. But, you know, I've given you some ways to deal with the conversations, to get involved, get it initiated. And I've encouraged you to practice the technique, and you can do it with anyone. You can do it. Men can do it with other men. Women can do it with women. Men and women can do it together. You can teach your kids to do it. What's important here is you have to know what you honestly feel. So you need to take time to figure that out. Now, what this may bring up for you is you may be faced with, okay, what do you do with those feelings once you know them? And what if a discussion brings up some things that you can't resolve? Now, that's key. So what do you do in that instance? What I'm going to say is you jot down those particular things. I mean, it's nice when these things turn out great. You find some way to agree on everything, but you know what? That's not realistic. You're going to come up with things that you don't know how to resolve. You write those things down. I say you take a break, maybe think about those things overnight, because sometimes in the business of having these conversations, you sort of get on a roll and maybe even a roll with the attitude, but you get on a roll and then you have this difficulty. And it's just about having a gut check here. We need to take a step back and think about something like that overnight even. And this is something that works for me. I tend to have, I could have a rough day or something, and when I sleep on it, I come back the next day. Oftentimes, I'm much more calm. So being rested, I think, is very important to know about yourself. Some people, when you're trying to have conversations with them, when they're tired, they're irritable, you get the worst of them. And you need to be able to check in with yourself to see where are you at on that spectrum. So if you're having one of these conversations and you're starting to run into some dead ends, well, think about it. Like I say, jot those things down and revisit that the next day. And why do I say the next day? That's so that we resolve it so that we don't just put that on the back burner and never get around to it. Because quite often, that's the problem in the first place, is why we don't resolve things and move on and get things handled. That's the sweeping the things under the rug. So you put it on the back burner. Not back burner, but you put it on your note to handle it later, and take another try at it when you've had a chance to think about it, because it may give you an opportunity to think about it in a different way, and you can solve that problem. Now, if you get to a place where you are at an impasse, now, my thing to do is, in these cases, is what can you live with? Some things you just can't solve on your own. And it may be, this is where the art of the compromise comes in. It may be an opportunity for you to gift your partner with saying, hey, you know what? This one, we'll do it your way. We'll do this for us, for the relationship. Remember, it's the relationship here. There's three entities here. There's you, there's your partner, and there's a relationship. So for the sake of the relationship, we're going to do it the other person's way. And that's a great gift. That's also putting something forward. That's investing in the relationship, but that's also showing an example of what you do when you care about somebody. And I think the opportunity to do that happens every day. Again, that's what I call compromise. And if we are still looking at something that needs a little more attention, needs a little more work, then it might be time to call in for help. That could be a counselor, somebody else. It could be a minister, someone who you have some respect for, that you might trust, that you can sort of share some of the details with them and ask them their advice. Because most likely there is somebody else out there who has dealt with a problem. And remember, what we're doing here is we're trying problem-solving techniques. We are doing the straight talk, because that's how we resolve problems. Not the passive-aggressive thing, not sweeping things under the rug, but building a rapport with your partner so that when things come up, we will deal with them, we will handle them. And what you find is, when you do that, when you make it a point of being in discussion about things rather than letting them fester, then the love is there from your partner. The trust is there, and it spreads. You just never know how big of an impact something like that can make until you start to do it. And I think one of the nicest things is when something that you have been practicing with your partner is when your partner has an opportunity to share with you the very thing that you've been trying to gift them with that understanding. It's a wonderful gift. I get reminded of that when I have conversations with my kids, and things that I have shown them, when I see them use examples towards me and they remind me of it. And it really warms my heart, because a lot of the things I've actually forgotten that I showed them, but when they do it, I'm reminded of it. So so it comes back in many ways, but it's nice that when that happens. So I've been talking about straight talk, and I hope this helps you immensely. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast, and I want to thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmc.com. www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.